So there's always a difference between, am I writing for a client as a copywriter, or am I writing copy for myself? So focusing more on that latter one, what are the values we're trying to get across? Like, what's unique to you? All that stuff is super important, because certainly with the way businesses and online businesses are going now, it's not really enough to have a good product anymore, because so many people have good products and there's very little differentiation between a lot of the stuff out there. That for me, it's how can you get yourself across the personality? And that all comes down to being unique. So one of the exercises that I will do with people if they're working on setting up a business and marketing it is, what are your core values? I wouldn't try and write copy, because when you try and write copy, you potentially fall down the hole of trying to write to sell. And I think that can be quite off-putting for people. Whereas if you just put across your values and you put across what's different to you than the competition, that is a massive factor in terms of getting people to buy into you and your personality. Because when people buy into you, you don't actually need to sell them that hard. Try and write less copy and try and put yourself across in terms of what differentiates you more.
Mike, how are things?
I'm very good, mate. How are you?
I'm good. We were just talking about your next 100 miler, which is in 8 days, 9 days ish.
Yeah, so at the time of recording, a week tomorrow, I will be an hour and a bit into the arc of attrition. So yeah, probably already very cold, wet, muddy, and looking forward
Full
to
of full of regret
yeah,
and
more or less, yeah.
self-loathing.
Yeah, you know
Yeah,
the game
well,
plan well.
at this part of the year, I'd rather you than me, to be quite honest. I am very much cosmically drawn to another 100 miler at this point, and I think I'd like to do the West Highland Way in one go at some point to sort of tell that story, because it's such a popular route. But that's not a week away, so I can sleep a little bit more soundly at night. But we'll dive straight in. You have generated over $170 million of sales for clients through copywriting over the years, but you have a background in personal training. So explain to us, how did you get into copywriting?
So I guess the probably the last 13, 14 years or so, the long story short would be that I'd sort of left school and didn't really know what I wanted to do. So like a lot of people, I enjoyed wearing a tracksuit and I enjoyed going to the gym. So personal training seemed like the obvious career choice. I got into it and worked in the gym for about 18 months, but to be honest, I was super shy. I was very introverted. And when you're 18 with very few social skills, having to go into a busy gym and literally walk around and ask people to pay you money for training sessions, it's probably not the best personality match to a career. And so I kind of didn't do too well at that, really. I just about survived in London for about 18 months, but decided I still wanted to do personal training. And so I moved back to where I am originally from, which is Southampton. And I started up a mobile personal training business, which actually really took off. It's, I think, partly sort of just gutting it out and sticking with it, partly learning a bit of marketing stuff. But I got into doing that, was super busy for probably the best part of about 4 or 5 years. And then, like a lot of people do, I decided this isn't particularly scalable. It's not particularly leverageable. I didn't really want to go down the route of owning a gym. So I got into online personal training, which I guess would have been probably 2013, 14, when it was a fairly new concept still. But that kind of took off fairly quickly. And the way I got clients was purely social media, a bit of email marketing, a bit of blogging. Other fitness people asked me to start doing that for them. So I thought, why not? It's a bit of side income. And then that really led me down the copy route. So I ended up kind of discovering copywriting, so to speak. Had a couple of mentors in that, and then I made the switch full time in about 2016, I think it was. So I sort of rode the line between copy and online fitness work for about a year. And then one of my mentors said to me, you probably need to make a decision about this because you're a bit of a jack of all trades at the moment. And I just thought, which do I enjoy more? Which gives me more freedom? That was the copywriting. So yeah, the last 6.5 or so years, I've been pretty much making my living from writing words.
It's interesting because I feel that writing language is a very protected career, a very academically ring-fenced corner of the world, because I was very driven by English literature and English language at school. I mean, my sort of three levels were English language, English literature, and history. Oh, and theology was in there as well. But again, all very written focused, because I had a real ambition to become linguistically eloquent and clear, essentially, but within the parameters of academia, which is essentially dick measuring and convoluted language. So with that in mind, I think people hear copywriting, they assume university degree, they assume qualification, they assume honing and refining these skills over the years and being a walking, talking thesaurus and dictionary. But it isn't that, is it? It is a form of marketing which is invoking emotions, clarity, solutions to problems that people might not yet know that they have, and you have found a way to make that scalable. So what do you think the essence of copywriting in the modern world is? Because I myself, and I'm sure others listening, in the back of their mind might still have a little bit of a perception that it's a protected space, when in reality it isn't, is it?
No, absolutely. I think there's a differentiation that I will never say that I'm a writer because I don't have those qualifications. I've never done any writing courses. I still make mistakes with my spelling. I still kind of mess up a lot of stuff with it. But copywriting is really writing to persuade people in terms of it might be to buy something, or it might just be to take a certain action, like click on an ad, watch a video, read more of a post. But for me, it all comes down to connecting with people. And that's why I think that so much of it is about simplicity. Like, you don't need to be a particularly technically gifted writer. Like, if you look at the way that I write, and a lot of the best copywriters write as well, and I'm not classing myself in that top tier, I'm just drawing comparisons, but a lot of our work is, you look at it on a page, it's very short sentences, there's a lot of white space on the page, we use very simplistic language. So I will always, I'll often use an app to look at my writing once it's done, and we aim for sort of a grade 6, grade 7 level at the most, because you don't want people to be confused. You don't want them to be thinking, what's the meaning behind this? What's that word about? It's much more, how can we relate to people on a base level, I guess, and just tap into what they're already feeling in terms of what they're struggling with, in terms of what they want to achieve, and how can we position our product or our message or even just our brand as the thing to solve that problem for them. So you're differentiating yourself from the competition, and I guess showing empathy as well. You're showing that you really understand where they're at and where they want to go to, conveying that in the simplest manner possible.
Do you think there is a difference between persuasion in a written format and persuasion in a verbal format when it comes to introverted versus extroverted personalities, in terms of, are you a salesman in your mind, or are you in a different category? Because essentially you are doing the role of a salesman in a written format versus a verbal format. Reality, the outcome and the sort of the mechanism is the same, but the sort of distribution method is what's different. Do you think that is down to an individual's personality, where their strengths might lie, or do you think it's just something that you have trained yourself to become more competent in?
That's a really good question, actually, which I've never been asked before. But I would say that there is definitely a personality factor attached to that. I would consider myself very average at selling in person. If you picture your typical salesman or saleswoman, that's not me at all. And I don't really take that style into my own copy as well. I've got clients who, they do prefer a slightly sort of more direct approach, a bit harder hitting, your typical slightly older school advertorials, infomercials, that kind of stuff. And I think that's dependent on voice, and that's dependent on brand and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think there's a big difference, because you can take someone who's a very good salesperson and they've probably got that natural gift of the gab. They probably haven't necessarily done that much training, but they've just sort of got the natural talent to be able to sell, to be able to persuade, all that kind of stuff. I mean, we've all seen the market trader who can pretty much get you to buy anything just from being a bit flirtatious or complimenting you and having a chat. And I think that kind of person might typically struggle to put their message into wording, because so much of it is conveyed through personality, through tone, through body language, which you can get through with a written word, but it is more difficult. Likewise, a lot of copywriters, for me, a massive part of copywriting and selling, especially if you're doing client work, is about research. So it's about looking at, who am I selling to? What are they struggling with? What do they want? and then forming your arguments and your sales material around that, which obviously you can't necessarily do so much in person. So a lot of the best copywriters are pretty introverted. They're not the kind of people who would deem themselves a particularly good salesperson, but they will go away, extensively research what's needed, and then be able to put it on paper. So I think you can have both, but in my experience, most great natural salespeople, if you told them to write down and sell, they completely bomb, certainly on their first few attempts. A lot of copywriters, you could put them in front of someone who's 90% sure they're going to buy a product, and they might still freeze because they're just so not used to having to do that on the spot.
It seems that one is much more analytical and deliberated, whereas the other one is much more soft skill, human, and almost behavior pattern focused, which is an interesting nuance. So as somebody that would like to think that I've been forced to develop sales skills verbally over the years, it sort of forces me to reflect on, well, how direct and specific and clear can I be with whenever I'm trying to translate that into the written format. And I'll hold my hands up and say it's not something that I would say I'm particularly good at, but I definitely think that in terms of the storytelling from a video point of view, I've definitely tried to translate some of the values that I find important to me. I've tried to translate them into a visual demonstration from a sales method in terms of, I believe that people should train like this, or I believe that people should step out their comfort zone in this way. So I think the missing link in my chain is probably being able to write that down in a way that's clear rather than simply matter of fact, which we can speak about afterwards from a personal level. So with that in mind, there might be people listening that are trying to build out email lists. There might be people with small businesses. There might be people tasked with generating sales within the business they're in. There might be people that are considering, well, if I was to start a business alongside my full-time job, how would I be able to scale that? I don't have a social media following, etc., etc. So what are the biggest mistakes that people make when getting into written marketing? And I think, please add anything to this, but that's blog posts, that's sort of SEO, that's email marketing, and probably website copy and social media posts as well, obviously. If there's anything that you feel is important within that ecosystem, please do flag it. But what are the mistakes that you've seen people make enough times that you can flag them now for people to avoid?
Well, I think actually relating back to one of the comments you just made about your own marketing, values is a massive one for me. So one of the first things I will say to people, even if they've got very little copy experience, is that if you're doing personal branding, so there's always a difference between, am I writing for a client as a copywriter, or am I writing copy for myself? So focusing more on that latter one, what are the values we're trying to get across? Like, what's unique to you? All that stuff is super important, because certainly with the way businesses and online businesses are going now, it's much less about the product, because so many people are selling fitness coaching, business coaching, graphic design, whatever it is, that it's not really enough to have a good product anymore, because so many people have good products and there's very little differentiation between a lot of the stuff out there. That for me, it's how can you get yourself across the personality? And that all comes down to being unique. So one of the exercises that I will do with people if they're working on setting up a business and marketing it is, what are your core values? So is it personal freedom? Is it locational freedom? Is it family stuff? Are you someone who really, really values honesty and integrity? And we'd all say that we do, but is that kind of one of your core drivers in there? Is it the idea you want to give back? And those ideas should all come through in your content and your copy. Not necessarily every single post has to talk about locational freedom, time freedom, family, but throughout what you do on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, that kind of stuff should be dotted in. And I think a big mistake people make is trying to write copy. Yeah, everyone should pick up a few copywriting books. I mean, something like The Ultimate Sales Letter by Dan Kennedy is a great start. There's a bit of a higher level book, but it's still a good read, called Breakthrough Advertising by Eugene Schwartz. Anything like that. Alex Hormozy's books are very good, although not copywriting specific. They contain a lot of copy principles. So pick up a few books and read them, but I wouldn't try and write copy, because when you try and write copy, you get into you potentially fall down the hole of trying to write to sell. And I think that can be quite off-putting for people. Whereas if you just put across your values and you put across what's different to you than the competition, that is a massive factor in terms of getting people to buy into you and your personality. Because when people buy into you, you don't actually need to sell them that hard on stuff. You can essentially say, yeah, here's who I am, here's what I do, here's this product, here's how it would probably benefit you. Would you like it? People are going to say, actually, yeah, I trust you. You seem legit. I'm going to put my hand in my pocket. And that's grossly oversimplified, but long answer short, I guess, try and write less copy and try and put yourself across in terms of what differentiates you more.
It's interesting, actually, because as you were talking there, I've sort of reflected on, again, that weak link in my chain that I've just referred to. And we have been very tactical with Omnia Performance specifically in terms of how we have focused our marketing, which we've just found to do what we do because we enjoy doing it. We know the value in it, and it's very easy to translate that to people because we're just having fun and essentially living what we're trying to sort of sell to people. We have capacity in terms of how much we can manage from a service point of view, but we've never really thought, right, let's think about how we can really sharpen the arrowhead from a sales point of view here. And that means that we've essentially used written format marketing channels as updates rather than anything particularly nuanced. And it's something that will change this year, I think. I think we'll probably just be a little bit more active and consistent and want to get that right a bit more so that we can almost share more of the successes and the value in what we believe we've created, which we very much do buy into. But we have so much faith in our integrity and the values that underpin the business and ourselves as an individual that we feel actions speak louder than words to this point, which is interesting because it's happened by accident, but to almost reinforce what you've said, it comes from the values that underpin Johnny and I. So to give an example in real terms, to sort of give a big tick in the box for the example you just given, I'd say that, well, there we are. That's how we've executed things over the years, and it's an ever-changing process. But I think values underpin our individual mental health, our individual approach to businesses, our individual approach to how we can scale, how we can grow, where we devote our time, where we allocate our time. And I think the more that people can calibrate on and reflect upon their values, the more aware, more self-aware that they'll be on a regular basis. So I've heard you speak about imposter syndrome before, which is a very hot topic in the modern world. And it's something that I occasionally fall into the trap of, but only when I'm taking on big risks in sort of new frontiers. And I've heard you speak about this specifically when you were transitioning out of fitness training into when you were doing your remote personal training business into more of a copywriting demand. So do you want to just explain to us what the challenge that you faced from a sort of identity point of view was there and how you overcame that as not a crisis, but as a consideration for you internally?
Yeah, it was certainly a weird one. I think that I've always been someone who, not so much now, but certainly in the past, I sort of swung more towards having some self-doubt. So I just wasn't particularly confident growing up. Wasn't super shy and anxious, but yeah, certainly I was one of these people who second-guessed a lot of things and often wondered, am I making the right decision? So for me, that was a relatively difficult time because you are aware of what people are thinking, or more likely what you think people are thinking, because actually most people are so wrapped up in their own world that they don't even give what you're doing a second thought, whether it's good or bad. And that's certainly a trap I think we can all fall into. But there was definitely a period of probably 6 to 12 months or so where whenever you're trying something new, and I'm sure you probably got the same when it was going from pure powerlifting to the endurance stuff, you worry about, are the powerlifters going to think that I've somehow lost my credibility as a powerlifter, or are the endurance athletes going to think, who's this guy who's coming in and trampling on our territory? So that was certainly a bit of a concern. Looking back now, I don't think I verbalized this or even put it in my own head then, but one of the things I realized is actually having some imposter syndrome is good. Like if you don't have any, you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough. So I think that reframing that into, rather I'm worried about this, reframing it to I'm excited about this. This is a way for me to feel excited. It's a way for me to feel like I'm growing. So from the mindset standpoint, that was pretty big. I had a couple of, I say weird bits, maybe they're not that weird, but a couple of practical things that I would do. So I had sort of two personas, so to speak, and I had fitness Mike and copywriting Mike. And so Fitness Mike would be very much in the fitness mindset. I was still actually doing a bit of in-person personal training back then as well. So I was sort of, tracksuit and branded polo shirt and that kind of stuff. But when I went to do writing, I didn't let myself go and write in that. I would put on jeans, I'd put on a nice jumper. So not exactly getting suited and booted for an office, but I would do that. I'd go to a coffee shop and that would be my writing time. So fitness stuff, I'd forget about it. I wouldn't answer client emails. I wouldn't do programming. I wouldn't listen to fitness podcasts. It was very much those two worlds. And I think that's something where obviously my situation was specific, but if you've got someone who's going from corporate gig to setting up an online side hustle, have that separation. So in terms of environment, you might want to, if you've got a study at home, just use that for your online side hustle. Or if you're like me, I do really enjoy working from coffee shops. Go to a coffee shop to do your online stuff. Don't do it at the office. Don't do it when you're sitting on the sofa at home. The more you can get into a different mindset, the better. Even if stuff like change of clothes do help you, in my mind, that's no bad thing. You don't have to do it. That was like my small trick, I guess, for almost fooling my brain into thinking something else. But that was a pretty big one for me, I'd say. I'm sure there are other stuff as well, but yeah, the differentiation between the two different mindsets and locations and physical stuff, along with just realizing actually people just don't really care about what I'm doing.
It's absolutely critical in my point, the clothes point, because I actually have separate wardrobe / chests of drawers for different business related activities. It's got to that point where I have my day-to-day in and out of the office stuff, which is the sort of stuff that I'd wear if I was going for dinner with friends in a sort of informal setting. I then have my modern mind, corporate and school setting stuff, which is Chelsea boots, smart shoes, chinos, Reese, merino wool, sort of East London commuting into Liverpool Street sort of vibe. And then I have my day-to-day Gymshark attire that I wear whenever I'm in and out of the gym, whenever I'm working from home, and it very much gives me clarity on what tasks are being executed. The other thing is, I've spoken about this in YouTube videos as well, is when I have my Garmin on, I'm focusing on fitness activities. When I have my sort of Swiss watch that I attach to certain activities, I'm switched on to those things. So I have very clear state changes in terms of that. And I've noticed that when I think, it doesn't really matter, my mindset just shifts entirely. So it does matter. It does matter to me, and it matters to other people. I think coming out of lockdown as well, especially, we got used to maybe going from wearing a suit and a tie to just wearing a shirt. And then actually the shirt became a polo. And then actually everybody was just in t-shirts. And then before you know it, the process and structures that underpinned your routine and your mindset going into each day were eroded, and it actually meant that the day was harder to get through. And I think another thing I want to touch on is, you mentioned you enjoy working from coffee shops. Yet there's a huge camp online that will say you shouldn't work from coffee shops because coffee's £3.85 and that's a terrible use of money. But if that £3.85 gets you 6 hours of uninterrupted quality work that earns you more money, rather than 2 hours of quality work and 4 hours of dicking about scrolling on Reels, then it's a very well spent £3.85. And I think this is where people put themselves too much in boxes on this sort of thing. And it ultimately comes down to create boundaries between businesses, focus points, hobbies, income streams, whatever it might be, but then find the structures that work best for you, and don't take what one person on the internet says as gospel, because that works for them and it might not necessarily work for you. But whilst we're on the topic, obviously copywriting is your expertise, but I think the essence of what you've created and the way in which you've managed and scaled it over time is something that's quite applicable to the side hustle culture or concept in general these days. And in terms of advice, managing an exit from one career, business, focus, industry into another, for those that might be considering developing a secondary income stream, or might be considering moving away from their full-time job, or might just be a bit despondent or lacking fulfillment and looking for a way to find that forward motion, what are the things that you would say to them to give them a little bit more confidence to start moving things forwards?
Personally, I'm certainly more of a moderate risk taker. I am a bit more averse to risks than some other people. So there's this big culture online of, I think the phrase is like, jump off the cliff and grow wings on the way down or something, as in if you put yourself,
That's very me, to be fair. I'm laughing because I feel attacked.
I think that it works for some people. I was generally going to say some people thrive off that. They like to be thrown at the deep end. They can afford to do it. Maybe not necessarily in like a purely financial sense, but it's one of those things where I often hear that phrase and think, but if you're a person who's got to support a family and 4 kids and a mortgage, it's probably not the smartest approach. It can still work, but some people do like that. So I think if you are the kind of person who thrives on, maybe if you're the kind of person who at school you would leave your homework till 11 p.m. the night before, that approach might work pretty well for you. But like I said, I'm a bit more moderate with my risk taking. So whenever I've chosen to make some sort of change, I've thought, okay, what do I need in order that if this completely bombs, what do I need so that it's not going to be a failure or so I'm not in trouble? And that for me was always making sure I've got sort of 6 to 12 months of living expenses saved up. That's, I think, a very practical way of doing things, looking at it like, if everything went wrong, I would still be okay with that because I've got enough saved up. The other thing I like is, I think it was something from Tim Ferriss. I'm not sure if it was him who came up with the concept, but this idea of if everything went wrong, how quickly could I get back to where I am now? And he said that most people don't choose to go in a new direction because they worry they'll lose everything and they'll have to go back to the very first job they ever had and they'll be on minimum wage and they'll be destitute. Actually, if you've got a good job now where you've got a decent reputation and people like you, it's probably not going to be that difficult to get back there. Okay, you might have to start at a lower position. It might not be the same company, but you could probably go back to them in 6 months and say, look, as long as you leave on good terms, if you give your boss 2 fingers and, kind of nick stuff from the office on your way out, probably not. But if you leave on good terms, you could probably go back in 6 months and say, look, what I was going to do, it didn't really work for me. Is there an opportunity here? Even if there's not one there, they're probably going to say, well, actually, here's some people you can talk to. You've got your network, you've got all your connections. So looking at it in terms of that, I think is very, very useful. And then there's always going to be a time where just because there are only so many hours in the day and in the week, you're probably not going to be able to get it to, let's say you're earning $3,000 a month in your job. It's unlikely you're going to be able to get your business to that $3,000 a month as well at the same time. So you can completely drop one and then entirely replace it with the other. But perhaps just dialing back living expenses for a bit, which again is boring and practical. But if actually that means that then it gives you those few months where your business doesn't have to kind of be a 10 out of 10 straight off the bat, 6 months, 12 months, 2 years time, you could be earning 5 times that, 10 times that. To me, that's not a bad trade-off. So all kind of very practical stuff, but just having some sort of safety net in place, because ultimately it's very easy to get comfortable with where you're at and to not then push yourself, which I think that just for most people tends to lead to a whole lot of regret, especially if you are ambitious and you want to do something a bit outside the box. So having those strategies in place for me is a big thing where, there's some sacrifice for a while. You've got to crunch some numbers, but from a practical standpoint, that's going to give you the freedom and confidence to go out and think, do you know what? I don't need to get everything perfect. I can play around with this for a while. I can have some ups and downs, and it's probably still going to be okay.
There's lots there to unpack, and something that I think is important to mention is to clarify the jumping off the cliff with and build the wings as you go argument, because from my end I'm very high risk, but it's very high calculated risk, and the more that I have understood how to build the wings as I go, the more faith I have in the level of risk, and things start feeling less risky, if that makes sense. So I kind of have this opportunity curve where if I can plot out and roadmap the way I see the risk unfolding, then I'll commit to it and figure it out as I go. But there's a lot of thinking that goes into the time before jumping off the cliff, if that makes sense. And I think there's a lot of what you said that's probably a little bit more conservative than my attitude would have been previously. The way I looked at things was, from an income point of view, was the time versus income equation, whereby if at a full-time job you're earning $3,000 a month, and in 40 hours a week, and then in 10 hours a week you're earning 1,500 quid a month. Well, at that point the income time equation has essentially, you've exceeded the curve of your full-time job. which means that logic says, calculated risk, that if you committed more time, then you would be able to sort of exceed the existing curve and provide that security without necessarily waiting longer than you might need to out of fear, because I think fear is a very positive thing when reframed into an opportunity and an excitement to go after something like you've said. And definitely have a safety net, I think is the obvious one, but also don't do yourselves the disservice of actually looking at what you are earning after tax, key point, and then actually being able to commit and get a plan in action when you're ready to make that switch. And the main thing is, going back to one of the first points you made, is I don't have kids to worry about, which means that I can do a lot more. I can be a lot higher risk at this point because I don't have dependables to worry about. And a lot of people, the recommendation I've had that really, really got me thinking about this differently when I was younger was, the sooner you do it, the more you can essentially invest in your future, in the sort of sweat equity and the time committed earlier on. Because if there's somebody that's 21 years old doing grad ski and thinks, yeah, I'd love to work for myself, it's probably the time to start exploring options of how you can do that. Because by the time you're 35 with 3 kids and you're on 250 grand a year in London because you've climbed the corporate ladder very, very well and you've got 3 kids at private school, then all of a sudden you need to be earning 12.5 grand a month to be able to actually bridge the gap. So you're either buying into a life of compromise, or you take the decision sooner to essentially suffer a little bit now to thrive later on. And I think it's important to, especially now that the sort of average age of people having this quarter-life crisis sounds a bit flippant to say, but people are becoming more and more aware of what's fulfilling to them and how they want to spend the rest of their life. I think the pandemic's partly responsible for that. I think social media communication and the opportunity presented to us is responsible for that. But people are finding more and more creative ways to earn a living that isn't in the Big Four consultancy job that they might have previously thought was the solution. So yeah, there's so much value in what you've just said, but it's interesting to compare my perspective a few years ago, somebody without children, and with maybe a slightly shorter timeline of 3 months of safety nets, all I'll need. I'll figure it out as I go. And worst case scenario, I'll essentially, the other thing to consider is if you look at the living cost expenses, you might even need a safety net, because if everything falls flat on its face, you can pick up 10 hours a week part time that will be able to pay your living expenses, and then you've still got the time. So the trade-off is, what are you getting intrinsically from the time spent building the business? Is that more valuable than money in the short term? And these are the questions that I think are important to ask people in the modern world. So scaling a business to $170 million of generated sales for your clients, I can imagine there were some hiccups along the way. So do you want to talk us through what the biggest challenges were scaling a business that is essentially blueprintless? You had to figure this out as you went along. You essentially had to, you had some wings built before you jumped off the cliff, but you had to add some feathers, didn't you?
I think that's a very good metaphor. Yeah. One of the big things in terms of what to do, and actually I was thinking about this when you were talking a second ago, was that for me, I don't necessarily like cheesy business cliches, but the one of your network is your net worth is not 100% correct, but there's a lot to be said for that. Thinking about what you were just saying is that the more people you have who you can connect with and talk to, and if you are in a tight spot, reach out to, the easier you will find it to get business. Even if those people aren't paying you directly, everyone knows someone who would need a copywriter or a fitness coach or a mindset coach or whatever it is you're doing. It's the whole 6 degrees of separation. Actually, it's probably more like 2 degrees of separation. So the more you can network, then the more you can give without expecting anything in return as well, the idea of reciprocity. So a big thing that I picked up from a couple of early mentors is just reach out to people and tell them you like what they're doing. If there are people a few rungs up the ladder from you in the industry, and don't send a DM and say, I like what you do, what you're doing. Is there a way we can work together, or can I do this for you? Just tell them you like what they're doing. Tell them something specific they've put out that's really helped you. I did that a lot in my early days, and that got me some really cool opportunities in terms of client work and going to events and that kind of stuff. So that would be a positive action to take. Again, it's not super high level strategy. We're not talking about you need a webinar funnel or here's how to write the perfect ad. Like, that stuff can come later down the line, but I tend to think far too many people try and prioritize the tactical strategic stuff over just the fact that it doesn't matter if you're in a B2B or a B2C, so a business to business or business to consumer world, you're still talking to people ultimately, and people act in certain ways that are predictable. If they like you, they'll want to do business with you. If they physically can't do business with you because they're at capacity or they don't have funds, they will like to recommend you to other people. So just never forget you're always dealing with people. So yeah, lose the corporate jargon, become friends with people ultimately is a big thing. In terms of mistakes, for me, it might not apply to everyone, but I think anyone in a business where you're dealing with clients is client selection. I certainly made the mistake of taking on anyone who would pay me, which for one, I think comes across as quite needy. So I would sort of happily, well, not happily, but begrudgingly drop fees to get work through the door in the early days, which just ends up with you resenting your work, doing too many hours. Often those kind of clients are not the best type of clients anyway. So I would say for people, stand firm on your fees. And just if you get red flags as well, like I think I mentioned one of his books earlier, but legendary marketer Dan Kennedy used to say that if he woke up 3 mornings in a row thinking about a client in a negative way, that for him was the key, that he needed to fire that client straight away. And I think I've had that with clients, but it's been more like waking up 3 weeks in a row with negative thoughts about them and not firing them because I'm thinking, but they're paying me 25% of my monthly income at the moment. And having that very much a scarcity mindset, thinking there's no one else out there who could replace that. In actual fact, there are thousands of people who pay twice as much, be a lot less hassle. So making sure that you are relating back to what we said earlier, values. I would say a key value for everyone should be working with clients who you would happily go out and get a beer or a coffee with, not just accepting anyone because they'll take you on. Because ultimately, if you have clients like that or customers like that, it's going to burn you out. You're going to hate it. So yeah, just being selective and not being needy are big ones.
Interesting. It's something I buy into massively as well, because I kind of buy into the gut feeling of, do I get on with this person? Do I anticipate there's going to be niggles here? Are there certain things that make me think actually the value of this per month versus the value of this per month with a different person is actually not the same? And you do, again, we're speaking from positions here of having gone through it to some degree. You're far more seasoned than I am, but there was a period where, again, it was every time somebody drops off, it's like, oh no, what's going to happen now? Well, somebody's going to replace them. And often it's kind of, the churn was kind of almost at equilibrium, which is a fantastic position to be in. But the fear and the emotion that went with it was something that's taken a lot of practice to be completely neutral on, because it makes you feel like you're doing something wrong. It makes you question yourself. It makes you wonder, could things be different? Is the system wrong? Am I doing enough? And then you ask along the way, well, actually, that person leaving might have been a good thing. Yet here I am stressing about it because of the principle behind it. So emotional analysis from a personal point of view, but from a business point of view, I think is something that I found helped us scale. So it's interesting to hear your take on that there. From a personal point of view as well, we've spoken a lot about values. So I think it's important to lay down the foundations of what values are important to you personally. What are the values that underpin everything you do? Because I think that'll set the scene a little bit more for the final question I have, which is a bit more about the introspection that comes from ultra-endurance training.
Certainly freedom. I've always been someone who said that money and finances are a value to me, but they're a lot lower down the spectrum than having freedom in terms of time freedom, locational freedom, the freedom to pick and choose who I want to work with are big things. Reliability and consistency as well. I think that, again, if we talk about a copywriting world, a lot of copywriters are notorious for not being particularly reliable and consistent. They can do great work, but they're a bit more on the sporadic end of things. So I knew that for me, it's always been something anyway. I'd rather be like consistently 80% at something than sometimes be 100%, sometimes be 50, sometimes not be anywhere to be seen. That's definitely a big one. And also I think that anyone who sort of has engaged on social media knows I'm a big advocate for freedom of speech, and for having opinions, but being open to debate and discussion as well. So I try and weave that idea into my content as well. Like I love talking about ideas with people. I love debating topics in a nuanced way. So yeah, that kind of thing, I try and get through quite a bit. So essentially it all relates back to freedom, I guess, in terms of doing work that you enjoy. and actually waking up every day. Maybe you're not always a 10 out of 10, but it's rare that you're less than a 7 out of 10 on the excitement scale when you wake up in the morning. So yeah, freedom, personal autonomy, and just kind of having fun when you work, not taking stuff too seriously, I think is a big one.
Do you view money as a currency to purchase freedom, or do you view money in a separate dimension?
No, very much the former. Yeah, I think I have a life I enjoy, but ultimately for me, as long as the bills are getting paid every single month, I'm not too fast. Like I can go quite happily go months and months without launching anything. I can quite happily go for months without trying to actually push too hard in business. If things start taking a dip and I start to think, well, actually, I might not be able to go away as much, or yeah, anything like that, then I will actually push for it. But yeah, it's well, anyone who knows me knows that I don't. I'm not kind of crunching numbers at the end of every week, thinking, "Oh, what's the profit and loss this week?" To be honest, if you asked me what my profit percentage was, I probably couldn't even tell you.
Lovely position to be in. It's the reason I ask is because I had some fantastic conversations on the podcast with Nick Majuli and Daniel Crosby, who we both explored the idea of money and happiness and the relationship between them. And the conclusion, generally speaking, was beyond being able to pay the bills on a month by month basis, there's a very slow upward curve in terms of happiness beyond that point. However, below that curve, the correlation between happiness and income is quite severe. However, I have always framed post downturn in my mental health, when success was very binary and greasy pole and corporate Western world sort of existence, I viewed money as a sort of currency in and of itself and a metric to focus on, whereas now it's very much a case of money can give you the freedom to be able to do more of the things that you want, which can therefore lead to happiness. So money itself doesn't equal happiness, but it's interesting to ask you because you are so freedom oriented, whereas whilst I do value freedom, I've put myself in a position where I'm bottlenecked and don't actually have much freedom over the things that I have created as a result of my own creation. So it's interesting because I'm forced then to reflect on, well, is freedom actually a value that's important to you? And if so, you'll make adjustments to make that the case. But then there's the commercial side of me that says, well, if you take your foot off the gas, then you're going to slow down and miss out on growth opportunities. So I'm just essentially having a minor meltdown on this podcast. But these are the questions to ask ourselves, and I think it's very important to explore that question specifically in the modern world, because we've so often been told, no, money doesn't equal happiness. Get that idea out of your head. Well, no, directly it doesn't. But if it can give you the freedom to determine, if you can work now to buy yourself the opportunity to have more freedom, that might mean more time with your kids. That might mean more time walking in the woods with your dogs on a Wednesday afternoon because you decide that's what you want to do. It might mean that you've got more time to train for an ultra. It might mean you've got more time to explore new places. And those things and the experiences that come with that freedom are the things that scientifically are reinforced as giving us happiness. So, no, interesting to hear your values, and it makes sense why you're in the position that you are. So with that in mind, freedom being a key value, you choose to spend your time willingly suffering from an endurance point of view, which is something I can't sit here and chastise you for because I very much buy into the same camp. But what are the things that draw you to ultra endurance races? And do you just want to give us a bit of background on your sort of athletic experience alongside the copywriting business so that we've set the scene? Because I'm sure we'll have a huge amount of crossover in terms of the value that we draw from it. But you have more freedom than I do to manage and determine what goals you're working to from a training point of view, which sounds ironic given that's a huge part of what I do. But essentially, every month I need to be looking and crunching numbers, which is not a position we're in yet. So training is something I very rigidly need to structure and plan across the course of the year to understand, whereas you can almost just focus on the value of it in and of itself, which is something that I don't always feel like I can in this day and age. Again, a problem of my own creation, but just something I want to be honest with. So break it down for us in terms of, I know 100 miles are your specialty, and you've got one next weekend, unfortunately. But yeah, just talk us through your athletic experience today, and then principally what value you gain from it.
Yeah, so I think my journey, so to speak, is probably relatively common, as in I was a slightly chubby teenager, not massively overweight, but you sort of hit, 13, 14, and all of a sudden as a male, you realise that girls don't particularly like guys who are slightly on the chubby side for the most part. So started getting into a bit of fitness stuff then. And I think I started just with basically running, and my dad had an old easy bar that I used to take out to the garage and just do curls and shoulder presses and stuff with. And then I discovered Men's Health and what were the muscle building ones? Flex and Muscle and Fitness. So obviously then I went down the route of, well, this is what Ronnie Coleman does to train and how Ronnie Coleman eats, so I should probably do that as well. Had a few years in my bodybuilding phase, which is really just gain a bit of muscle, but put on quite a lot of weight that wasn't muscle as well. And then I guess I think I was 23 when I did my first powerlifting competition. And for the next 6 or 7 years, it was purely powerlifting based. I'm always super honest. Like I'm not a fantastic powerlifter. I think best total was 1,165 pounds in the 74 kilo class. So it's okay, but it's nothing spectacular. But yeah, I think I did about 10 or so competitions over that 6 or 7 years. And then it was actually during lockdown, I got back into doing a bit of running. So just kind of 10K distance or so. And I thought, I'm quite enjoying this. And I was getting bored of just doing bodyweight lunges in the garden. And I know I'm talking to the guy who lunged however many miles for the challenge. So probably a few sets of 50 is absolutely nothing in comparison to that. But I was getting a bit bored of stuff. So got onto some running. And I was actually listening to a Ross Edgley podcast. And I'd been thinking, that was right, I did a half marathon. And I thought, I'm going to go up to a marathon and see how I do, because the half was okay. And I heard Ross Edgley talking to someone, and he said, well, if you're going to do a marathon, you might as well go a tiny bit further, and then you've run an ultra. And that sounds a lot cooler, because actually a lot of people run marathons, not many people do ultras. And I thought, yeah, that makes sense, really. Not that I've run an ultra.
Out. Yeah.
Yeah. So I entered my first one, which was, I think that was 53.5 miles from Goodwood back to Winchester.
Didn't start with 50k. Very bold, very bold. You had the opportunity to go for the low hanging fruit, and you didn't. Respect.
Well, actually, the initial one I booked was a 24-hour looped race, and the guy who was helping me out with my training said, you might want to try something a tiny bit shorter. So here's a double marathon. Try that one instead. So yeah, still kind of a pretty big jump up from a half marathon. I think I did 27 miles in training before that. So I'd done a marathon distance, just not under race conditions. And yeah, that would have been, I think that was June 2021 I did that one. So yeah, 53.5 miles. I then did a backyard ultra, which is one of the, you do 4.2 miles on the hour, every hour, last runner standing. Which was interesting because you're not running particularly fast, but it's a long time. Mentally, it's very difficult because you just don't want to leave that aid station every hour. That one was also, we had a pretty challenging course. There's about 750 foot of elevation per lap, I think. So it's pretty gnarly. Yeah. But that was the first time I ran 100 because I had in my head, I want to hit 100 miles. I hit that 100 miles and all of a sudden I was just like, nope, done. No more. Which was interesting. That was a cool experiment. See just how the brain can switch off and be like, I just don't want anymore. That's fine.
Yeah.
Then I did the 24-hour race. I think I clocked up 124 miles for that. And then last year I did another 3 as well. So another double marathon, another backyard, and then I did another 100 that was an event I designed that much inspired by your own events. I did a numbers-based one. So it was £1,000 total, followed by a 100-mile run with a 24-hour cutoff. And yeah, I've got my next 100-miler next week. So that's the last few years of training, really.
Very nice, very aggressive upward curve. Huge fan. And anyone that brings in arbitrary numbers as a way to work in a horrible weekend or day out, I am a huge proponent of. So what intrinsically do you get from it?
For me, I described it to someone the other day. It's the sense of satisfaction having done it. And the only way I can describe it is that I think if you don't train, when you go on holiday, the feeling you get when you get to your villa or your hotel or wherever you are, and you sit down on the bed or sit by the pool and you just feel kind of nothing else matters. Like it's a huge relief. You feel like you've really earned that downtime. That's what I feel for all of 48 hours after an ultra race. So it's just the most relaxed, the most content feeling in the world. that all your stress from everything else is gone. Yeah, the satisfaction, I've never found anything that lives up to it than after running some sort of ultra event. I'd also say it's just a conversation starter with people as well, because I've never met anyone who you started talking to and they've not been interested in it. It's something that's always fun to talk about. And then I suppose the other big thing for me is without getting too philosophical about it, I think if you have a healthy body and a healthy mind and you're capable of doing this kind of thing, while I don't think it's an obligation to go out and run 100 miles, I do think that you kind of owe it to yourself to at least push your limits in some sense. And for some people, that might be running a 5K. And I think that's perfectly fine. I think do something that challenges you. But there are a lot of people who can't do that, whether they don't have the physical health, whether they don't have the mental health. And without being morbid, I kind of think if I was in that position, what would I give to be able to run, even going to a park run on a Saturday morning? And none of us know what's going to happen in future. Like, we always want to look on the bright side and imagine living for decades longer and being healthy and happy, but we might not. So in my mind, I think, well, actually, if I was, to use the cliche, it's overdone, but hit by a bus tomorrow, would I be happy with what I've pushed myself through physically and mentally? Actually, yeah, I could probably say now I am. That's not to say I don't want to do more, but we've got healthy bodies and minds. Why not see what they can both do?
What a fantastic point to finish on. Why not? Exactly that. Well, thank you very much, Mike. What is the best place for people to find you, connect with you, explore your services and offerings?
Probably Instagram. So just the Coffeeshop Copywriter, all one word. I've got the normal Linktree link in the bio, or I'm always happy to answer questions if people want to drop me a message.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mike. Really enjoyed that, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, mate. You too.